Greetings, good storytellers. I'm the Artful Narrator, and it is my privilege to welcome you to learning the tropes of writing. I'm currently in the process of creating a episode that is going to be entitled An Introduction to Disability Diversity, and I'm quite proud of how that's going along. But in researching that, I realized that I still have not come across, in 17 years of looking, a protagonist in a story that has type 1 diabetes, that is presented in any way honestly as to what it actually is like. The few examples that I have found are just, horribly cliched and full of misinformation and just very tone deaf. And this got me thinking, I should probably write a story that has a character with type 1 diabetes as the protagonist. And why haven't I tried to do this up until now? And the honest reason is that I tend to write mostly fantasy. And fantasy is a setting that doesn't work as well with the sheer amount of paraphernalia that type 1 diabetics need to manage their blood sugar. And, you could ask the question, perhaps you could just present a historically accurate depiction of what it was like to live with type 1 diabetes in, more of a, ancient, Greece or medieval setting, something like that. And you can do that. It's very easy to do that. The way that you would depict that is the person would be dead, because type 1 diabetes for thousands of years has been a fatal condition. You would last maybe a couple weeks to a couple months. You'd be dead. It isn't up until the last 100 years or so that science has given us the tools we need to not just be able to live with it, but to have some semblance of a fuller life with it. But there's just all these different things that are needed to make it work. So the task that I have today with this video is to examine, what would you need to do to write a character with type 1 diabetes in a fantasy setting? Now, first and foremost, we need to just completely remove the idea of using magic, unless this is a setting in which magic is more akin to science and is very quantifiable and it works in smaller ways. That would be all right. But if magic is in any way, elusive and just sort of, it can do these incredible things, then there would raise the question of why doesn't the person just use the magic to completely cure themselves? And the out of story reason is, then that stops being a story about a protagonist with type 1 diabetes, and it becomes a story about a protagonist who magically cures their problems. And that isn't helping increase representation of people with type 1 diabetes in stories and authentically replicate what it's like to deal with this disability. And that authentically and honestly part is the thing that's most important. Because, as I said, there have been enough examples of people, not nearly as many as I would like, but still more than enough bad examples of people getting type 1 diabetes wrong. And so we don't need more of those. What we need is people getting it right in spirit, at the very least, even if they need to make a version in which the technology is more fitting with this fantasy era. Create parallels between what modern diabetics use and what might be available in this fantasy setting with different, maybe Archimedes style, steampunk technology. So for those of you that don't have type 1 diabetes, like as I do, type 1 diabetes, also known as juvenile diabetes, is a chronic condition in which the pancreas produces little to no insulin. Insulin is a hormone needed to allow sugar to enter the cells and produce energy. Without the insulin, the sugar builds up, and that spikes your blood sugar and creates all sorts of problems. And despite there not being a treatment for this up until modern times, this is a disease that has been known of for a long time. I was stunned to learn that apparently all the way back 3,000 years ago, the ancient Egyptians made reference to a ailment and the side effects of which were excessive urination, thirst, and weight loss. And those are all symptoms of very high, very out of whack blood sugar from type 1 diabetes. So people have known that this is a thing, they just haven't had the technology needed to take care of it. And so that's what we're going to try to figure out today, is how can you get the fantasy equivalent of this technology? And to do this, we need to break it down into 3 areas, 3 different important components that type 1 diabetics deal with every day. Now, the first and foremost is you would need some way for your protagonist to give themselves the insulin injections. And you could, save yourself some trouble and, forget about trying to scientifically explain how they, create the insulin. Originally, it was taken from, like dogs' pancreases and pigs' pancreases, and refined so that it could be used with humans, and eventually synthetic versions made. But you don't need to get into all that. You could just say it's an alchemical process, not magic, but the classic alchemy, which is just the precursor to modern science. Mixing together different components, refining reagents and ingredients. So, all right, the person can go and get this from an alchemist. All right, they've got the insulin. How do they give the injections? Well, syringes aren't the modern hypodermic syringe isn't something that wasn't invented until like 1850. So again, it could look out of place to have that hypodermic syringe, something as visually familiar as that, in a fantasy setting. Interestingly enough, there were actually ancient equivalents of this. Apparently, the pre-Columbian Native Americans were way ahead of everybody in that they actually created some early hypodermic needles and syringes, basically using hollow bird bones and small animal bladders. So, I mean, there is a way that you could, just straight up use that if you want. But, and that's possible. But I honestly think that the easiest way to depict your character, how they would get their insulin, would probably be to actually go a step higher in the historical technology of diabetes and go for something that is a little bit less iconic than a syringe, but still just as functional. Now, you could either use an insulin pen or an insulin pod. Now, what an insulin pod is, that's what I use, it's if I can get that so that's less reflective, there we go. Oh, it's a teardrop-shaped little device, has adhesive on the bottom. You stick it to your stomach or your arm, and then you activate this, which is the control device, and it causes that to insert a flexible needle. Basically, it's called a cannula into the skin, and you will fill a pod up with insulin once every 3 days, put it on, and be able to give yourself shots that way by typing it in here. And obviously, this uses energy cells and wireless communication and things like that your character wouldn't have. But what you could do if there's pseudo steampunk technology in this setting is you could create a version of this that is housed in brass or bronze and has a reservoir in it that is filled with insulin. And then rather than adhesive, perhaps this is held in place on the stomach or on the arm with some sort of straps, kind of like a bandolier worn under the clothes to hold it in place, or again some sort of strap on the arm. And it can just be understood that this inserts a needle, and that you're able to dial in the amount of insulin you want to give on the device and press down on a area, and it'll give the shot. And that's what insulin pens are. They're basically this hypo spray looking sort of thing from Star Trek that you will put an insulin cartridge in, and you will dial in the amount of insulin you want to give, and then insert it and press down on the top, and that will give just that amount of insulin that you need out of that full cartridge, instead of requiring you to draw insulin out of a vial into a syringe and then inject that. So it's much more portable, easier to have on the go. And the benefit of using something like either that or the pod is that it could look dressed up with the right gadgets and gears, could look like it would be at home in a sci-fi setting. The person dialing in, not using technology, just using gears, dialing in on that pod the amount of insulin they want to give, push the button, give the shot, or doing that with the pen. They would obviously need to change needles, but it would be far enough removed from the classic idea of a syringe that I think it could work. And the best part is it would not require any power whatsoever. It's just using gears. So that would be something that you could physically have in that era, and it would work. It would theoretically work. Obviously, the exact, could you get the gears small enough? Could you, get all these fiddly bits just right? That's not the stuff that you necessarily need to get perfect. You just want to get the experience right and the spirit of it right. So then, well, that's one component. What's the next component? Well, the next component that's very important is diabetics need to test their blood sugar. Or that's how they can find out whether they've given the right shots. The blood sugar ranges from, it's basically graded on a scale of like 0 up to 500, I think, something like that. At beneath 20, you're dead. At above 300, your blood sugar's high and you need to do something about it. Upwards in like 500, you're getting really, it's bad. An ordinary range is about 150. That's where you want to keep it. So, traditionally, blood tests didn't even come about until like 50 years ago, and diabetics will have these little strips. This is a combination blood reader and a PDM control device for the pods. And so you just prick a finger, hold it up to that, and the blood would go in to the test strip. It would process it electronically and give you a pretty close reading. It varies by a few points, but you've got a pretty good idea what you're doing. And now, all way too advanced, way too high technology for a fantasy setting. Honestly, the best way that you could probably do this would be creating a facsimile of what this is. My light is blowing everything out. But so what this is these are keto sticks. And so this is what diabetics use to test when they're sick, to see if their body's been thrown out of whack enough to the point where there's so much sugar in their system that it's getting flushed out in the urine. And so you would dip one of these sticks in, the sticks look like this. Dip one of those in a little sample of urine, and the peach-colored pad on the end would change into one of these different, one of these different color gradients. There you go. From there to no ketones, all the way up to purple, which is you've got a lot of sugar in the blood. And this is fixed by giving yourself extra insulin and things like that. But the way that you could use this is have this be the way that your diabetic in this fasting test their blood sugar. Not by urinating on one of these sticks, but instead have it be a small stick of some sort of paper that has been treated with some sort of alchemical reagents. Again, you don't need to get specific, but the thing that you can say is that the person will apply a drop of blood to that area on the end of the stick, and that within a few seconds, the paper will change color. The alchemic agents on that paper will change color to reflect approximately what the person's blood sugar is, and rather than it being numbers from 0 to 500, instead it would be more of these colors indicating a range of like basically low to like stable, or like low to normal to medium to high to very high, and maybe very low, something like that. It's those equivalents. And obviously that would not give you the best control over your blood sugar, but it would at least be more akin to what modern diabetics have, and it would allow that authentic experience of the person doing the test saying, I'm a little high, I need to give an extra correction, or I'm a little low, I need to eat first and then give the shot. Things like that. Then the final element that you would need is you would need some equivalent of basically the standardized nutritional information that we have on things now. That tell us the carbs, the calories, because diabetics need to count how many carbs they're having so that they can know how much of a shot to give. They've got ratios. For me, it's 1 unit of insulin for every 10 carbs that I eat. But obviously, in a fantasy setting, it's very unlikely that there's little strips of nutritional information on bread that you're buying from Hardy and Sons and ye old bread shoppy or something like that. So what you'd probably have to do is basically what diabetics have to do when it comes to like food at restaurants and things like that, is just have a base understanding from prior research of understanding, all right, an apple is roughly X amount of carbs. A potato of this size is about 20-ish carbs. And just by knowing the different components, gauge approximately what is in the meal that they're having and give a ballpark estimate. And then from eating that meal multiple times and doing blood tests afterwards, find out, all right, my guess was too low or my guess was too high, and fine-tuning it. And so you could create a good facsimile of that by having, and basically there'd be, some sort of alchemical textbooks, written by, healers and things like that. That's a treatise on how many, if you didn't want to say carbs because that's more modern, you could say sugars or something like that, because sugar is a word that's been around for forever. So you could say how many, sugars are contained roughly within an apple of this size, within, bread of, a slice of bread of this size, and et cetera, et cetera. And through trial and error, or especially if this is a setting that is, if this is a story that's tied to a specific location, then your protagonist with type 1 diabetes would have definitely, sampled food from the different eateries over the years and would know approximately how much to shoot for each of those meals. And with those three things, you would be able to have in the insulin, the blood tests, and the counting and accounting for the carbs, for the sugars, you could create a fairly realistic experience. And again, the important thing is to make it something that, while not all the science is exactly one-to-one, that the experience is one-to-one, that it is able to be something that depicts a lifestyle that someone who has type 1 diabetes and reads that book can go, yeah, that's what it's like. And someone who doesn't have it could read that book and go, oh, now I finally understand what what my friend has to go through, or things like this. Because there's just so much misinformation out there that it would be so beautiful to do more stories that highlight people with disabilities, is people with different, all these different points of view. That's what excites me so much about diversity in storytelling, is that it's the realization that there are stories out there that haven't been told, and that you could tell a fantasy, adventure mystery with a protagonist that has this unique perspective of being a type 1 diabetic. It isn't a story about type 1 diabetes. It's a story about adventure fantasy, but it's a adventure fantasy with a protagonist that has type 1. And that creates, a beautiful sense of uniqueness, and allows a whole subsection of people to finally feel like they're being seen. Now, I know that this is more of a niche video to a degree, because type 1 diabetes is very important to me, but I know I've been talking about this on the channel a lot. I am moving the majority of the type 1 diabetes content over to a separate series on the channel. There'll be diabetes tips and tricks, anecdotes, things like that. But some of you, raised an interesting question in one of the last the question video they did. Raised the option, hey, maybe you could talk about diabetes in a way that, how it could be used narratively, and that was some of the genesis for this video. And I do hope to make further individual episodes on how you would do a character with a different disability or a different point of view, things like that. But this was just the natural one, because I know all this stuff. I have to live with it, so I'm able to give an honest depiction of what it's like. As always, thank you so much for watching. I hope that in some way this video was informative, or at the very least, a pleasant diversion. Until next time.